Hey, what's up, all you beautiful people? Welcome back to the podcast. Now, if you're watching on the YouTube channel, you can see we are in a new environment. We are up on the rooftop right now. It's a beautiful, I don't know, sunny 70-ish, 80, almost 80-degree day here in Minneapolis, which is like a rare treat. So I thought we'd come up here on the rooftop and chat a little bit because honestly, this month it has been an insane month. Been traveling a lot. At the beginning of the month, we spent a little bit of time in Austin doing rally car racing, and then Jamie and I we went to Ireland for a couples retreat, which was amazing. And then just last week, my buddy Hunter Thompson invited us out to Cabo to speak to his mastermind of about 30 super high level elite real estate investors who combined in that group had raised something like $382 million of equity. So that means they probably, in that group, they have purchased well over $2 billion of real estate. I would have to imagine. So that was a rare treat getting to come out there and speak to like a group of true badasses who I view in a lot of cases as peers, but even some people on that journey who are like well ahead of where we are at Invictus Capital. So that was a real treat to be able to go out there, share our journey, our experiences, and ostensibly that trip. The reason Hunter wanted me to come out there was to talk about YouTube and the success that we've had on that channel over the last year, which has been absolutely extraordinary. Like going from 220 subscribers in October to a little over 135,000 just 9 months later. Here we are in May. It's been an incredible journey, and so he wanted us to come out and kind of share what was working for us and what maybe other investors could take away from that. But in the process of like talking to these guys and gals, very quickly I realized in the conversation that they don't need to hear the tactics. Like that's what most people think that they need. They need to hear about like, how do I make a thumbnail? How do I get a good title? How do I do all that stuff? And those are the type of questions people like to ask is like the tech stack, what hardware do I need? What camera? All that stuff. But what really became clear very shortly into the conversation was, okay, you guys don't need to hear that. You actually need to hear about storytelling. You need to hear why that's so important and how you can develop as a storyteller. So we spent maybe like 30 minutes on the nuts and bolts of YouTube, how to build an audience, how to build a channel, and then the better part of an hour just talking about storytelling. And it was so fascinating to me to see how as the conversation shifted towards storytelling and really tapping into like what makes you unique in the space and like sharing your personal journey, your stories, and how to tie that into lessons or into unique value propositions for converting an investor into investing with you. How people just became like glued to the conversation because I think we all realize that storytelling is important, and subconsciously I think we all want to be better storytellers. And if you think about it, like, it makes sense because that's like the primary way we convey emotions. We connect with one another. And we've been doing it since we're young children, right? Like we are professional storytellers in a lot of ways. But when it comes to like telling those stories in an intentional way that drives a result, suddenly people become very, very silly and very stupid, and they start saying dumb things or saying things in a weird way that just don't really make sense. And so, what I want to share with you guys here is some takeaways that in the conversation we had with those guys that you might be able to apply in your day to day life to become a better storyteller. And I do believe storytelling is a skill that you can improve with intention. And just like any other skill, like the more you do it, the more reps you're going to become better. But there also has to be a certain level of intentionality because just doing the thing more clearly isn't going to make you better unless you're taking time to reflect and taking time to iterate and then ideally get some feedback on it. And so if we don't have that feedback loop, then we're really just going through mindless repetitions, and that's not necessarily going to make us better. So I want to give us three things to think about next time that you're working on telling stories. And one of the best ways I think to become a good storyteller, this is one of the things that I did. A little backstory here is I have been writing science fiction and fantasy novels for the better part of a decade. And so I was immersed in the world of story structure, but and that's very helpful. But when it comes to telling your stories to other people and communicating it, whether that's through the written word in emails or in a blog post or through a video like this or an audio format like this, um, that those structures aren't as important, I think, as just understanding some certain principles. And so the first way I think to become a good storyteller is to take these principles in mind and then practice telling stories with them. And if you're kind of shy or feeling like I'm not ready to put these stories out there in the world because they're just not very good yet, like truthfully, like um, it takes a while to get good at telling your stories. What I did back in 2020 was I set the goal of just creating one video every single day and posting it to Instagram. Now, I did that on a live channel, but what you could do if that feels very uncomfortable, like the idea of getting in front of a camera and starting to talk is very uncomfortable, then just go to Instagram, start a private channel so nobody can see it, and then start posting your videos. And what this is going to do is this is going to lead into the first takeaway that I have for you, which to becoming a better storyteller is to understand your stories. Like, and the best way to do that is through repetition and telling them and exploring them in an environment where you're not feeling like you're worried about people judging you and like what they're going to think. So Instagram private channel can be a great way. You just put the videos out there, you get the repetitions in, and you start to develop a better understanding for what your stories are, which leads into the idea of keeping a story Bible. So a story Bible is just a notebook, a journal. It could even just be a spreadsheet on a computer. Really, it doesn't matter how you track it, but it's a way of taking all of your life stories and putting them into a place so that you can see them, and then you can start to flush them out with intention and say, how can I take this story about the time my dad took me out for ice cream when I was 7 years old and it fell on the ground and I cried and he said, hey, you know what? Don't cry over spilt ice cream or whatever. How can I turn that into a story that delivers a lesson, a message within, say, a business context or whatever the product or service is that you're selling to your consumer, or trying to connect with a loved one? How can you take these stories and then turn them into something that's not just about the story, but is an analogy or a metaphor for something larger? And so step one is just start writing these things out. Like, take an hour every day for a week and just start brain dumping every story that you can remember. And I'm not at this point asking you to write out like paragraphs. Like, this should just be bullet points, like ice cream with dad, 7 years old, or chess tournament, 13 years old, or heartbroken, first love, high school, whatever. Like, just bullet point them. And you should come up with ideally 100 stories, but truly, like, this is a ever evolving document. So you could easily get 1,000 stories in there. Just think of like how many stories are taking place over the course of your life, and they don't even have to be big stories. They can be small stories. Like, and you might not even be able to see like what's the value of this. Like, this is such a small, stupid story. Like, nobody's ever going to get any value. And maybe you never do tell that story in public, but having it out there gives you the raw resources to start building from. And I think that's the valuable thing at this point. Now, once you've kind of mined your own personal memory of your stories as much as you can, now you're going to go to your friends, your loved ones, your family members, and start asking them like, hey, dad, can you tell me 5 like embarrassing stories or 5 impactful stories that you remember from when I was a kid? And chances are you'll know most of the stories that they're going to tell you, but I'm guaranteeing that there's going to be like 1 or 2 stories that they tell you that you go, oh, I completely forgot about that. Like, it was so embarrassing. I forgot about that entirely. I just blocked it out of my memory because it was so damn embarrassing or whatever. And so that's how we're going to flesh out our story Bible. And then you're going to get your repetitions by like telling those stories every single day and then trying to figure out ways to tie those into larger lessons. But the second tip that I have for you in becoming a better storyteller is this idea that it's when you're telling stories, the goal is to express, not to impress. And this is something that I really struggled with for a long time. Like, I would tell stories that would position me as the hero and make me look good, make me look like a badass. But the problem with telling stories in that way is that people don't connect with you. They might be impressed and they might respect you, but we don't connect with James Bond, the perfect hero that's always out there doing these amazing, cool things. Like, we don't connect with him in a way that makes us want to be his best friend or, open up our bank account and invest with him or whatever the situation is. And so we want to be relatable. And the way that you be relatable is by sharing the Harry stories and kind of like taking yourself down a notch and not just telling stories with the idea that you're going to trying to prop yourself up in a cool way and make yourself look like the hero, but just saying, listen, like, this was the story. Like, self-deprecation and taking yourself down is a great way of humanizing and bringing people into the story, because ultimately the point of telling the story is not about you or positioning yourself. The goal of the story is for the listener to see a piece of themselves in it, to relate with it, and then connect with you. And so your story is really an avenue for connection with that person. It's not about you. It's just the vehicle to get them to come to you. And so when we are telling our stories, it's more important to express than it is to impress. That means we don't need to use big flourishing language. We don't need to have everything dialed in and perfect. We need to speak from the heart without hubris and without, too much pretense, which is hard. Like, I still struggle with this, but the goal is just to express as though you were talking to a loved one and trying to, like, really communicate them, like, your deep heartfelt emotions towards them, or things that you're struggling with, and, like, you're not trying to impress them, you're just trying to be understood and connect with them on an emotional level. And if you could do that, I think you will find that you people will start coming to you and saying, wow, I really connected with that story that you told, even if it's like the substance of it is very different than any story that they personally have in their narrative, right? Like, most people won't have the same experience playing chess when they were middle school as I did, but there are stories in that about how my dad left me at the tournament hall, didn't come in with me, and I felt very disappointed. I felt alone and abandoned, and how that, like, structured the relationship that I had with him for many years, and it kind of tainted how I thought about him and his love for me. But it was many, many, many years later that I started to realize, in my own life, that that was a way of showing love that that I couldn't quite articulate at the time. Okay, so that story, like the nuts and bolts of it, the chess and whatnot, and being abandoned, like, that might not resonate, but the feeling of, like, struggling with what's it mean to give and receive love from people that you care about, and how we all have different love languages, and that can be a struggle. And you probably relate to that in the sense of, like, your relationships now. Like, everybody has that, like, friction of, like, I give love in this way and I receive it in that way. And if that's at odds with, your significant other, or your mom, your dad, your brother, your sister, your coworker, whatever, then it can lead to these feelings of isolation and abandonment, and, like, feeling unloved. So, anyways, that's a long ramble. Okay, so we have, number one, get a story Bible, keep your story Bible. Number two is express, don't impress. And then number three is every story needs to have two things. Ideally, there's a couple other things that it needs to have, but ideally it has these two things. It has a hook and it has a tie down. The hook is the most important part of your story, because it's what gets people listening. It's the reason for them to invest more of their mental bandwidth in listening to you. So the hook has to be really, really good. If you don't know how to get people hooked into the beginning of your story, then they're going to string along and they're going to listen, but they're not going to be very invested, in the outcome. And you know the difference when somebody's just listening to be polite and their eyes are kind of wandering, and when somebody's listening because they're enraptured. And so that a lot of times comes down to the hook. So I would spend a disproportionate amount of time really figuring out, how do you segue into your stories? Like, how do I get them, hooked right from the start? Now, once you have them hooked, you can't just ramble from event to event to event, and then expect it to have a gratifying ending. And this is where the tie down comes in. You have to tie it down or wrap it up for them, right? And say, here's why I tell you this story. So many stories where it just kind of, like, peters out at the end, and it's kind of like, oh, and I guess you just kind of had to be there, right? No, you don't tell stories just to peter off at the end. You tell stories to connect and convey something. And so there's this old, copywriting adage. I can't remember who said this, but it was something like, you need to tell people what you're going to tell them what you intend to tell them, and then tell them what you just told them, right? And so it's the same with storytelling. The tie down is at the end, when you say something to the effect of, now the reason I tell you this is because, right? And so that story about my dad, abandoning me is, like, the reason that I tell you this is because moving forward in life, I realized how important it was to understand how other people give and receive love. Otherwise, I could love somebody with all my heart, but if they're not receiving it or not aware of it, of how I express it, then it's all going to fall on deaf ears, right? And so you are wrapping it up. It's like the summary, like, what's the takeaway that you want somebody to walk away from the story with. So those are three things that I think if you implement into your storytelling with intention, you will start telling way better stories for sure. Story Bible, express, don't impress, and then, make sure that every story has a good hook and a good tie down. Now, This is such a deep, important topic, that the idea of storytelling, that I'm going to create a little mini training, because I've never actually sat down to try and teach people how to tell stories. I've never tried to like take the ideas from my head and say like, what am I thinking when I tell these things? So I'm going to do that over this next month, and my goal is by the end of June to have a training available for anybody that wants to become a better storyteller. It's going to be geared more towards entrepreneurs and investors, people that want to sell a product or like sell their business, but it'll still be very useful, I think, pragmatically for people that just in day to day life with their friends and loved ones want to be like more, what's the word, more engrossing. No, that's not the word. I don't know, like more rapturing. You want people to pay attention and be like, damn, that's a good story. So if you're interested in that, make sure that you subscribe to this channel. I'll let you guys know when it drops, or just shoot me an email at Anthony at anthonyvicino.com, just saying, hey, I would like to be part of that storytelling training when it comes out, and I'll put you on the list to make sure that you get notified when that drops. But as always, guys and gals, I appreciate the hell out of you for being here. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to seeing you here back bright and early tomorrow. But until then, stay hyper focused, my friend.